Okay, thank you very much for your patience. As you can tell, Andrew Clapham is here and made it safely to Geneva. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for being here in this so beautiful Yvon Pictet auditorium. Looks very good. Quite a change from what we used to know at HEI a long time ago. Thank you to the Graduate Institute for welcoming this event. Thank you to Camelia for putting together this really nice debate tonight. A war, what is a war? What are we talking about when we mention armed conflict? Today is Human Rights Day, December 10th. Pinochet died on a Human Rights Day. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, today the big news was the official tribute to Nelson Mandela. Even Swiss television had to carry this on television live, meaning that somewhere this man is so well known not only for his personality, but for his own ideas of what human rights are. And not only did he have ideas about human rights, but he made sure that he would actually do something with it. And what did he do? He became the president of his country. And it was just so amazing today to see the first black president of the United States talking about the first black president of South Africa. Very, very interesting. And Obama said something very interesting that we will probably mention tonight. He said, of course, Mandela was such a great figure, such a great man. But he said, right here in this soccer city stadium in Johannesburg, right here, there are too many leaders in the world that are claiming solidarity with Mandela's struggle for freedom, but do not tolerate dissent from their own people. So he made it a point that, today was really Human Rights Day. So tonight, you will be able to ask questions. The panel is ready for all those very nasty questions that you will come up with. We will have the opening remarks with Ambassador Lindemann, who is on my right here. Just 2 or 3 hours. It won't take very long, don't worry. And after Ambassador Lindemann will join us here at the panel, we will, of course, give the floor to Professor Andrew Clapham. He's the man of the report, and he will mention, of course, what is inside the report. Andrew Clapham, of course, is Professor of International Law at the Graduate Institute and Director of the Geneva Academy. Sorry, Ambassador Lindemann, I didn't mention all your CV. Forgive me for that. And to my right is somebody who's brilliant. Of course, she's absent, Stéphanie Nebehay from Reuters. The people from APTN said that Reuters people are always late, so we won't talk about this. And a well-known figure of the Geneva International community, to my left, is Julie de Rivero, the Human Rights Watch. She's Geneva Advocacy Director. And you've been holding that position since 2000 for 6 years, quite a long time. Andrew Clapham, of course, and Professor Keith Krause. You feel at home here, don't you? This is your home. Thank you. You're Professor of International Politics at the Graduate Institute, and also, very interesting point, you're Program Director of the Small Arms Survey. Maybe not everybody is familiar with that, but it is very, very, very important. Well, so, first part, opening remarks, then, of course, the debate itself. What do we mean by armed conflicts? What does it mean to every one of us, to the diplomats, to the media people, to the university people? What does it mean? What do we make out of this report? And then, of course, you will have the floor, and again, you will ask all the questions that you want. Ambassador Lindemann, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is this working?
Go ahead.
So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it really gives me great pleasure to be with you tonight for this official launch of the first war report on last year's developments, 2012, that was established by the Geneva Academy. This report is a novel and unique project, and Switzerland is proud to be among the sponsors of the project. The launch of this report coincides, and it has been mentioned, with the Human Rights Day, honoring the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights but exactly 65 years ago. But don't worry now, I will not dwell into the relationship between human rights law and international humanitarian law, although that is a very fascinating subject. Suffice it to say, though, and this is both trivial and tragic, that wars in practice always interfere with the full enjoyment of human rights. All the more important is it that the laws of war, international humanitarian law, or IHL as we call it, actually apply where there is a war, because IHL provides at least some protection in the conducts, protection of the for those affected by the conflict, and also limits the conduct of hostilities. It is just as important, however, to be sure not to apply international humanitarian law where there is no armed conflict. As you are aware, some of the rules of IHL, such as the use of force, the use of lethal force in particular, but also provisions relating to detention, are more permissive under IHL than they are in human rights law. In a war, you can actually legally kill someone under certain circumstances, but it is much more permissive than under ordinary law, where you can basically not kill anyone except under very, very, very limited circumstances. So the notion of armed conflict must not be expanded to cover situations of armed violence that do not meet the criteria recognized under international law for an armed conflict. And I think here of situations of law enforcement, or also on the so-called war on terror. This is to say that the classification of armed violence as an armed conflict is really a decision full of consequences. It triggers, as I said, the application of an entirely new different body of law to a particular situation, namely IHL. It is decisive whether a particular conduct may amount to a war crime, and that implies other things like universal jurisdiction, for example, or no statute of limitations. It may also create the basis for jurisdiction for prosecutors in national courts, but also for international courts, such as the ICC. The qualification is, of course, important for the ICRC, which does the qualification for itself, but sometimes does not communicate it because it needs the qualification for its own purposes and not for communication. The qualification is also, or may be decisive for an involvement of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission, established under Article 90 of Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention. It's relevant for international organizations such as the UN for the conduct of their operations. In the case of Switzerland, it is also important because it generally leads at least the qualification of a situation as an international armed conflict leads to the application of the law on neutrality in the absence of a Security Council resolution under Chapter 7, at least. Now, as I said, classifying a situation of armed conflicts as an armed conflict is important, and it is supposedly, and we pretend this, based on objective facts only. In reality, however, we know that this qualification is highly political and very complicated. Often, the main actors either downplay the use of force and pretend there is no armed conflict, or the contrary, they exaggerate the use of force and pretend being entitled to use IHL in an armed conflict when in reality there is none. Especially with regard to non-international armed conflicts, one must admit that the legal threshold triggering the application of IHL is somewhat imprecise, and some situations of violence may in reality not be as clear as the legal categories would suggest. So the war report is really of great interest. For the first time, we now have an annual report that identifies situations of armed violence that amount to armed conflicts and discusses them in some detail. The report contains important and transparent analysis Thus facilitates classification and thereby strengthens the predictability of IHL. The report does not stop with classification, though. It also describes some of the consequences these conflicts entail. For example, by presenting statistics on conflict-related deaths and injuries. And finally, and this is very important, the report also discusses some very topical issues, cross-cutting questions related to armed conflicts. It presents last year's developments in themes such as drones, small arms, sexual violence, internally displaced persons, non-state actor violence, attacks on education, and national and international jurisprudence. In sum, the Geneva Academy's War Report provides valuable information, independent, impartial research, and legal analysis to policymakers in governments, the United Nations, international institutions, to national or international prosecutors, to NGOs, to academics, to journalists, and many others. I'll end here by presenting my compliments to the authors of the War Report. It certainly makes what I would call highly recommended reading to all of us. And I'm convinced that the War Report will inspire our thinking, guide our assessment, and influence our action. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lindemann. I should have mentioned that, of course, you are Deputy Director of the Directorate of International Law at the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, the FAE, and you also serve as Swiss Counterterrorism Coordinator. You mentioned the fact that this classification was highly political, and certainly we will spend some time on that matter. Andrew Clapham, in the first place, whose idea was that report? Was it yours, something that you had thought of a long time before? What was the purpose of the whole thing?
Well, thank you for that question. And just to be clear, you fingered me as the person behind it, but of course anyone who has seen it will see that the cover says edited by Dr. Stuart Casey-Maslin, who's with us and who's been busy launching it today. But I'm very happy to represent the Academy on this occasion. And you ask where the idea came from. I think there were multiple individuals who came up with this idea. One of the first people who noticed that there was a gap is someone called Professor Louise Doswald-Beck, who worked for many years as a legal advisor in the International Committee of the Red Cross. And when she took over as the director of the University Center for International Humanitarian Law, which is the precursor to the Academy, she came up at an early board meeting with the idea that we have annual reports on human rights, which are, as you may know, published by the Department of State of the United States government, which go through all the states in the world and explain what's wrong in human rights terms. And we have Human Rights Watch, which does an impressive annual report, and Amnesty International, and so on. More, I would say, related to human rights. But her interest was to say, why isn't there a report on international humanitarian law, focusing on which states are in armed conflict and which laws of armed conflict applies to those states? Now, we realized fairly early on that we couldn't actually write a report which detailed the violations. In order to do that, you would need to have a multi-million-dollar organization like Human Rights Watch with people all over the world, generously endowed.
I don't think anyone here has that kind of money.
No. Or the equivalent of the Department of State, who's represented here, with ambassadors who are able to report back on the situation. I don't mind sharing with you that we did actually raise the idea with the Swiss government that maybe their ambassadors would like to report back on international humanitarian law violations, and that we could include that in the report, but that was seen as too diplomatically delicate. So what we opted for in the end was a report which would state first whether or not there is an armed conflict, and secondly what is the applicable law to that armed conflict. And one of the controversial points which the ambassador has just highlighted is that we were keen to stress that it's not only the laws of armed conflict that would apply to those armed conflicts that we identified, but also international human rights law. And so if you were to go onto the sort of companion website and you were to click on Central African Republic or Mali or Burundi, you would see the applicable humanitarian law, but also the human rights law.
You just mentioned that there was a gap. Wasn't it rather a lack? I mean, that everybody could do with you know.
Well, you put your finger on it very nicely. Of course, it is convenient for states and I would say some international organizations, such as the United Nations, not to have to decide whether or not there is an armed conflict. And around the time that we were conceiving this project, the Secretary General of the United Nations came out with a list of armed conflicts in the world for the purpose of protecting children in times of armed conflict. And I don't mind saying he listed a couple, I can mention them, it's public knowledge. For example, at the time he listed Northern Ireland and Chechnya, and the ambassador of the United Kingdom and the ambassador of Russia went immediately to see the Secretary General and said, there are no armed conflicts there. And so you can see in UN Docs S/666 Corrigendum that it's deleted. So it is embarrassing for the United Nations to do this because member states don't like it being admitted that there is an armed conflict. And so we don't have that restriction. We're hoping that our funding won't totally dry up by taking on this task.
So the purpose is not to make new friends, huh?
Well, we're hoping that we will bring clarity and we will make some new friends, maybe not in the usual places, but we're hoping that journalists will be happy. We expect to upset some diplomats and some organizations some of the time.
Just one question. One question. Can you imagine a journalist like me going on Swiss television and saying tonight, there's a war in Mexico?
Well,
how would the people react? You know, except the fact that they would say this guy is nuts. I mean, there's a war in Mexico. People will. Where are the planes? Where are the armored vehicles? But there is a war in Mexico, and we've mentioned that, but we never did call it a war.
Unluckily for you, I was in Mexico 10 days ago, and I knew this might come up. So I was sitting at a lunch with a lot of people who were very well informed about international humanitarian law. And I said to them, they weren't prepared for this, what would you say if I said there's an armed conflict in Mexico? And the person to my right and the person to my left said, we agree. And they're trained international humanitarian lawyers. They know that the government wouldn't accept it, and they said, don't mention it to the government. But they realize that objectively, it's not mad to call it an armed conflict.
Tell us about the figures that are in the report. 37 armed conflicts, only one international conflict.
38, yes.
38. You almost said there were 2 international conflicts. What about the second one? Yeah? What about Pakistan, for instance?
I think
is the ambassador of Pakistan here somewhere? We might as well know ahead of time.
I think that's a very controversial point. I'm not sure that anybody could definitively say one way or the other. To the extent that Pakistan is not necessarily consenting to some of the strikes, you could argue that that constitutes an international armed conflict. But that would be maybe more recently, and I think since then Pakistan has said that they do consent, so that's controversial. To be clear though, when we talk about international armed conflicts, we should also include occupations, because the international law of international armed conflict would also apply to some of those. So I think what you're referring to is Sudan, South Sudan, as an actual hot conflict, if you like. But occupation would also trigger the international laws of international armed conflict.
Words are very important. This will be an annual report?
Yes, we would like to do it as an annual report. As I suggested, there is a website which allows you, called the Rule of Law in Armed Conflicts, which would allow you to tell what is going on month to month, rather than having to wait for December of the following year to find out for the past, or rather the previous 24 months ago. So we would like to keep it not only as an annual report, which people could look through at their leisure, but also as an active website where people could find out what our opinions are, but also make comments. It would be very useful if governments were to send in their thoughts as to why some of this was wrong or why some of it is right.
Thank you. We'll go back to you. Julie, this is good news for you. I mean, this is going to help you a lot. What use will you be making out of this report? You don't feel alone anymore. Isn't that great? With all those gentlemen around you.
I think the value of the report is that it really brings a lot of the big legal questions that we're having about these conflicts and puts them in one place and tries to link the facts to these legal questions. So that's the added value of this report. But I have to say that I don't think that it's the ultimate truth. I mean, there are aspects of this report that can be contested, and you've mentioned some of the controversial decisions that were made. I mean, you know, some scholars will argue that or some practitioners will argue that Mexico isn't an armed conflict and that it should be seen only from a human rights paradigm.
But at least the question is raised. Look, we're talking about it tonight.
I think that's the value of it. The value is that it really pinpoints all the key debates that are currently taking place in armed conflict and links that to the facts on the ground and does it all in one space. So I think that's the biggest contribution of the report.
There's one word that is very important in the report, is the concept of prosecution. If you don't use the right words for the right conflict, then there is no possible prosecution. Is that I would say, probably the good news of the report? Maybe Professor Krause can answer that question. With a microphone, much easier.
Well, I am not an international lawyer, so I'm definitely not going to comment on whether or not prosecution is the main object. But when I did look at the report, it raised the question of what is the audience and what is the intent of it. And I suppose, looking at it optimistically, we would say that this will start a dialogue between those people who have been looking at conflicts for many years through essentially a data crunching or political science lens, and have not raised very often the question of what does this mean, that is to say, what does it mean in human terms, what does it mean for the law and for prosecution. So optimistically, I think there will be a dialogue at least started, because the legal profession is entering this debate. There's, of course, a less optimistic version of what might happen, which would be a standard academic bun fight about numbers and about some of the more controversial judgments in here. And I think as a friendly dissident, we're going to have to talk about a few of those things tonight. I think it's fair to say that many Mexicans would be surprised to find that Mexico is at war. Many Iraqis would be surprised to find that Iraq is not at war. And I think that what's not in the report might be as important as what is in the report, and we should also think about what that means.
Why would Iraq not be in war? 6,000 people dead in 3 months? Is this just a natural disaster, a tsunami?
I mean, I think one has to realize that, of course, it's tragic if lots of people are dying, and that has, as you suggest, been the traditional way of determining whether or not the world considers this a war. And I remember the hot debate in the press, is Iraq at civil war, is it or isn't it? And it seemed to be a sort of rather metaphysical question that you could just say, well, I consider it is. The tests which have been developed when prosecuting war criminals in the Yugoslavia Tribunal and in the International Criminal Court are quite strict in determining whether or not we have reached an armed conflict. And one of the criteria is the level of organization and the command and control structure within a group. And if those groups are not organized in a way that meet those criteria, it is not possible to call it an armed conflict for the purposes of international humanitarian law. And to sort of go back to the controversy that you were introducing, one shouldn't want to introduce the laws of war too quickly, because if one does, as Ambassador Lindemann has suggested, one introduces certain privileges in a certain sense that it's okay to shoot to kill. Mm-hmm. And so in our rush to sort of qualify these things, it's not necessarily how many people are dying, but whether it's appropriate to apply that legal framework.
Mm-hmm. Julie, let's go back to that prosecution thing. Will it help you?
I think it's important to say that prosecutions, of course, aren't limited only to war criminals, that prosecutions take place for human rights violations, for crimes against humanity and genocide. And, you know, you don't just need the context of war to be able to proceed with those. But I think the important legal debate is always, you know, what are the rules that apply to the atrocities that are being committed, and what mechanisms are available to judge those crimes according to those rules. And, you know, within Human Rights Watch, sometimes we have very intense debates about whether we have reached the threshold of a conflict or not, whether we start talking about the humanitarian law framework or whether we stay and look at this only as a human rights violation situation. Because, as has been said, the threshold immediately lowers, and the vulnerability of civilians in the legal framework is higher for that.
Mr. Ambassador, going back to that prosecution idea, again, you mentioned just a while ago that all this was highly political. So it is understandable that some governments would not agree with what's in the report. But as a community, aren't we doomed to call a war, an armed conflict, and a war criminal? Wouldn't this be the pride of a country like Switzerland to mention that and to make sure that the ID is shared by everybody?
Well, actually, we do. Does this work? Okay.
Yeah, I guess so. Go ahead.
Sounds different when you speak in it.
Take my.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Actually, we do. I mean, in practice,
it doesn't have anything to do with censorship. I mean, nobody's cutting the microphone.
We try to make sure, of course, especially in respect of the Geneva Conventions, of course, we have a certain obligations, and we also make public declarations inviting parties to a conflict to respect IHL. But we don't want to rush into that. For example, in Syria, we were very careful at what time we were speaking about international humanitarian law, because, of course, if you speak about international humanitarian law too early, then it means that the regime can actually kill the opponents. And so you want to be very careful at what time you do that. And maybe in this respect also, and coming back to the prosecutions, it's interesting that the independent commission on inquiry that was established by the Human Rights Council had a relatively large mandate, but in the two first reports, it did not speak about IHL. It only spoke about human rights violations, and only in the third report it started to introduce the notion of international humanitarian law, thereby admitting that there was a conflict. So we have to be careful about the timing, and so it is very important what Andrew just said. It's not, you have to. And that's also what is political about is you have to know what you want to achieve in a way. Do you really want to give legitimation to a certain conduct and in calling it hostility?
May I ask the members of the panel how they qualify what is going on in Syria? Is this a civil war, an international armed conflict, an internal armed conflict? May I have the suggestions of the panel?
I mean, I think it's clearly an internal armed conflict. If you wanted to give it the level civil war, arguably there is some sort of nuance there, that the thing becomes more entrenched, more organized, and more violent. Arguably it's a civil war. Personally, I wouldn't have a problem qualifying it as that. I don't think it makes a lot of difference legally, but there might be nuances. Is it an international armed conflict? Well, strictly speaking, in order for that to happen, there would have to be another state joining in on the side of the rebels in a meaningful way.
There are.
There are, in the sense that they may be offering some sort of subtle support, but in terms of the tests which have been set down by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and other tribunals, I don't think we've necessarily reached that point of an international armed conflict, which would trigger rules of international armed conflict, such as prisoner of war status and other important factors. So, I mean, I'm sorry, it's a bit technical and probably not the answer you're looking for, but strictly speaking, it's the laws of internal armed conflict that continue to apply.
Julie, do you agree with this? Yeah, that's a very good answer. Yes, of course. Professor Krause.
Well, this is easy. Yes, I agree. It's a civil war. I like the phrase that, the laws of internal armed conflict apply to this. I don't think the warring parties give a fig right now about whether or not it applies, which speaks partly to when the law falls silent and what the limitations of this might be. So it would be, I think, a mistake if we end up in a sort of purely academic debate around whether or not we can define something as being subject to the applicable law. I think that isn't going to get us very far to thinking about how we grapple with some of these really very difficult conflicts.
Yeah, but in terms of solving the problem, does it make a difference? Does it help or not?
I think that
when all those people do come in Geneva on January 22nd, if they come, how should the media qualify the conflict?
No, I think that's a really important question that's at the heart of the purposes of the report to some extent, and I'd like to hear Andrew's
Thank you for telling me that my question was interesting. Thank you.
But I'd like to hear Andrew's answer in the sense that it speaks to whether or not this can make a difference, if these qualifications will actually help, whether it's negotiating resolutions to conflicts, whether it's preventing them from occurring because we have a legal framework that's robust enough to deter people. And I think that's something that's really an implicit assumption underpinning the report, and I don't know whether it holds in particular cases.
Let's hear the official voice of the DFAO.
Well, that's easy because we agree with Andrew.
That's the official.
That's
but
what
I told you I will not qualify any
official
conflict tonight officially, but this one is easy because we did.
Okay, Julie, you wanted to elaborate on this, I guess.
Yeah, I just wanted to say for us, it's not so much the legal qualification, what you call this, but what is actually happening to people on the ground. I mean, of course, we need to decide what this is in order to decide what rights are applicable, what standards are applicable. But for us, what we have to do is show, in real time, when a massacre is happening, what that's doing to people. And the question is, how do we mobilize the international community to react? And the mobilization of the international community doesn't hinge on the legal qualification. It hinges on the geopolitics of a situation. It hinges on how much you can mobilize the international community to respond to what's happening. I mean, in a way, I want to draw a parallel with some situations where there's been a debate of whether there is genocide or not. In the end, the victims don't care what it's labeled as. And it doesn't really matter, for responding to that situation, what we label it immediately. What's important is that the actual event that's taking place and what is happening to victims.
Well, but words are important. Look at what happened about Syria. 100,000 people were killed, but all of a sudden came the story about the chemical weapons, and it became absolutely intolerable to the whole world, and Obama and Holland were about to bomb the country. So words are important.
Words are important, but we all knew that Sri Lanka was in a state of war, and yet everybody let that war conclude, finish, and take with it 40,000 civilians without any reaction to it. So reality and what concretely is happening on the ground is also as important as that.
You know the difference in the media when it comes to a civil war. I mean, something that belongs to the people and to them only. There's not much attention. If you are able to prove that some other country is implied, then it makes a difference as far as the media are concerned, doesn't it?
It does, but I suppose I'd like to reinforce what Julie is saying, in the sense that we're now dependent on the international community reacting to Syria. But the fact that war crimes are being committed in Syria, as many people in this room know, triggers something called the responsibility to protect. Now, I can hear almost a sort of sharp intake of breath there, because where is he going to go with this? But
tell us.
If you don't have genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, you don't really have this political expectation that the international community should act. So calling them war crimes and calling it a civil war is important to get over that threshold. Right. And we don't need to get to the genocide issue. I agree with that. But the other thing I'd like to emphasize, and it hasn't really come up yet, by talking about a civil war and by talking about an internal armed conflict, it means that the atrocities that are committed in that context are war crimes. Now, you could say the parties don't give a fig, but I would like to disagree. I think there are some people fighting in Syria who are aware that what they are doing could be considered a war crime. Now, I know there's no international tribunal to prosecute them yet, but all the prosecutions that have happened with Yugoslavia and Rwanda happened retroactively.
Did you say yet?
I said yet, because I
think that there might be someday?
I think one should explain that anybody who comes from Tunisia or France or Britain who is fighting in Syria is subject to the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction. We don't have to wait for the Security Council. So those individuals ought to be on notice, and hopefully after the war report and a bit of media.
I'm not quite sure they will read it, but maybe they will hear about it. That goes for Syria. Of course, we could develop that for a long time. Tell us more about what's inside the report that we will discover and that will be a major surprise to all of us. In terms of armed conflicts, because of course you have reviewed the whole list. Some forgotten conflicts, some wars that nobody talks about anymore. Please don't read all the book. Oh my God. 450 pages.
I mean, many the people in this room are a particularly sophisticated audience, so I'm not going to pretend that the people here are surprised. But what I think is interesting are some of the partial occupations which are listed. Moldova, partially occupied by the Russian Federation. Western Sahara is a forgotten occupation. Then I could mention, obviously, what's going on in the Central African Republic is little understood, and here you have some of the details. You've mentioned Mexico already. Some of the activities in Thailand between the Thai armed forces and the independence one of the independence movements and so on.
You assimilate occupation to the beginning or the characteristic of a war.
No, I think
it sounds as bad.
It sounds bad, and I suppose part of our role here is to explain an occupation triggers certain protections in international humanitarian law. It's not a label that you stick on somebody because you don't like them. It's a fact, and legal consequences follow. And I suppose people might be surprised to see a long list of maybe 10 occupations that are listed. So that would be surprising. And I think our aim is really not to surprise people, but to educate and to explain how the laws of war work. And hopefully, and maybe you think I'm naive, the parties to these conflicts will take international humanitarian law more seriously as a result of projects like this and others.
Can I ask a very nasty question? Why didn't the ICRC work on that report? Why is it that they never started a report like this?
Well, there are plenty of people from the ICRC in the room. I keep catching their eye, and I'm sure they'll be happy to take the floor in a moment.
So I'm asking the question, but you give me the
I will
answer.
give you my interpretation. I think in my conversations with the ICRC, they have very good reasons for not doing this, because they need to keep on the right side of both sides to a conflict. If they upset one side by calling it a conflict when that side doesn't think it's a conflict, they will be denied access to areas that they already have access to. So for the purposes of protecting the victims of violence or armed conflict, whichever you prefer to call it, the ICRC needs to keep silent on some of these questions in order to carry out its work. Somebody like us, the Academy or other entities, don't have a presence on the ground, and our calling it a conflict is not going to jeopardize our possibility to do humanitarian relief because we don't do it. So I think it's perfectly reasonable for the ICRC to say, operationally, this makes no sense.
But in the same time, they're happy that you are talking the way you are. It helps, again.
I'm sure they have mixed feelings, I imagine.
Okay, just think what's happening now in some parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Those drones, we've all seen the incredible reports of those American soldiers back in Nevada or somewhere, and like a video game, piloting those drones. Is that an armed conflict between the United States and Pakistan, or between the United States and Afghanistan?
As I say, it depends who the United States is targeting, and it depends very much on the context. So if the United States were to use drones in an armed conflict with a group that they were actually engaged in an armed conflict with, that would be armed conflict. I wouldn't focus so much on the fact that it looks like a video game. I think the problem is when it is used against somebody who is not supposed to be killed. I mean, that is the real problem, and also the collateral damage that is engaged.
Who decides who deserves to be killed and who doesn't?
Well, I think that's the frightening part, yes, rather than the technology of it.
Mr. Ambassador, you're very silent tonight. Why is that? Why? Okay, tell us about the drone thing is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. What do governments, do states, take positions about the use of drones as a weapon?
Yeah, that's an interesting issue, because for a long time governments did not dare to deal with the issue. I mean, it was there, it was a big question, but you didn't talk about it. And only when the United States in themselves started the process of reflecting, and actually that was triggered not so much by international law concerns, but by constitutional concerns within the United States. How come that the president has a list every Tuesday morning to sign off, and is that constitutional under US law? That started actually the debate, and then when that debate started, governance started as well to discuss issues, and now it's really wide open discussion, there's lots of aspects: use ad bellum, use in bello, human rights law, For Switzerland, also issues like exports for technologies and so on. So it's a huge issue and is widely discussed, and we are happy about this discussion.
Mm-hmm. All of you, these days, how do you encourage armed groups to respect humanitarian international laws? Is there any progress at all, or is this just a dead cause?
Well, we have people in the room who know very well the work of Geneva Call. Professor Marco Sassoli was the president for a long while of the board. And that group has engaged with groups to try to get them to sign deeds of commitment, first of all on landmines and now with child soldiers. And indeed, they translated into Arabic a manual for the rebels in Syria, which was distributed widely, in order to encourage them to respect these rules, not because rules have to be respected, but using concepts such as honor and a sense that this is the correct thing to do because it relates to their own cultural preferences rather than something outside. So there is a lot of sophisticated work also done by the ICRC to encourage groups to abide by these rules, not because they think that they're going to be prosecuted, not because it's in the Geneva Conventions necessarily, but to appeal to a sense of inherent morality that this is the correct thing to do. So again, you can say I've got rose-tinted spectacles and I'm naive, but I think one should continue to press with rebel groups that they ought to respect these rules because it's the right thing to do.
Professor Krause, what about small arms? Any progress in the limitation of use of those small arms?
Well, I'm going to link that to the question about non-state armed groups, because I think that in addition to the work of Geneva Call, which started on landmines, there is a growing body of evidence that some groups are susceptible to pleas to respect various forms of legal regime. I'm not going to say it's IHL in the narrow sense. And that they do, even in the Libyan context of the Libyan Arab Spring, there were various brigades that actually put in place fairly strict regulations.
Why would they change their mind about this? What happened?
No, in many cases it was partly for the reasons that Andrew mentioned, that there is a sense of a particular warrior code, if you will, that they wish to be seen as functioning as a recognized military unit. And if they are recognized that way, then they have to behave in certain ways. There was also self-interest. It became clear with respect to the regulation of weapons that if these weapons were just let running around in the streets of their own towns, they were unable to fulfill the basic bargain they had made with their own population, which is, we're going to also protect you. I mean, we are fighting the struggle, but we're going to make sure that you're not preyed upon. And I think that this does occur in some cases. It does not occur in all, and probably one of the largest dilemmas is how do you deal with situations where the groups are much more fluid. And earlier you mentioned command and control as a very clear point of distinction about whether or not a group is a group. In many cases, when they sit down to negotiate, the group itself fragments and fractures, and there's a new leader emerging. And so under those kind of situations, it's extremely hard to be sure that there would be any respect of rules.
What does Human Rights Watch have to say about this? Any progress on the field?
First, I just wanted to clarify that Human Rights Watch doesn't have a position on war itself, because it tries to document, violations by all parties, and therefore to keep its impartiality. It doesn't position itself on the war itself. But, our researchers that are working on the ground in Syria, very recently, my colleague who's in Central African Republic, they have direct contact with the actors of war, and they explain to them that we're going to expose the atrocities that we're documenting, the abuses that we're documenting, and that they are accountable for what they're doing, and that there could be judicial prosecutions for what they're doing. And so this is the way that our work contributes to pressuring them into not committing such abuses and putting them on alert that they are being watched, that we have identified specific commanders, that we have identified specific units, that we know, patterns of abuse, that this isn't just, when we've identified that these aren't isolated events, but that they are a string of events that, so I think, putting them on warning is an important part of our work.
Mr. Ambassador?
On this point, I I think one of the biggest incentive for asking compliance of rebel groups is really that they strive for legitimation. I mean, they want power and they want recognition. They want recognition within the state in which they are, but also international recognition. And they know that if they do not comply with international humanitarian law and international law in general, that they will never get that. And I think that's the biggest incentive. But this makes it extremely difficult when you have these fractioned groups. That's very difficult, because then they will fight each other before having a coalition where they actually can strive for something more.
Okay, I think the time has come for you people to ask questions to the members of the panel. And please, when you ask your question, raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come, identify yourself, and please ask a short question. Don't make a speech, please. So who is the first person willing to ask a question? Let me see at the audience. I mean, they're so, here, somewhere? Can't, yeah, right in the middle. There. Just when I mean identify yourself, you don't have to give all your names and CVs and all that. Just say if you're a student, or go ahead. Sure.
Yeah, my question is more for Andrew Clapham. I was wondering how you decide if a particular conflict is qualified as a war or not as a war. Like, how does it look like if you like sit around the table somewhere in Geneva? And like you go through like a comprehensive list of like checkpoints you work through, or I was just curious about the whole process behind this raw report, because of course there's like some political implications behind whether you classify a particular conflict A or B, a war or not a war.
I mean, I think the short answer is that one puts oneself in the mind of an international judge, and one imagines, as the Yugoslavia judges did, on this day, does one have the intensity of violence, or over this period, is there the intensity of violence and the degree of organization to qualify this as a conflict? So we're using the legal criteria. Now, of course, it's been suggested that there are political things going on in the back of the minds of a government when they are determining whether or not they want to refer to Syria as an armed conflict. But to be frank, we don't have those considerations. We're not thinking, gosh, if we say this donor might back out, or if we say that, that's going to cause this humanitarian delivery to get held up at a checkpoint. All we're doing is applying the strict legal criteria. It might sound a bit clinical, but in a way, it's a privilege to be able to do that. It's not that we have a checklist, you know, and a sort of flow chart that you could do it like that, because that's not how the qualification gets made in law.
Well, of course, if you're not satisfied with the answer, you qualified for a second question.
Well, I mean, I think you've heard that Mexico is a controversial one. Mexico this year may not be in the same situation as Mexico last year, and Mexico next year, and Mexico the year before. So that is one which is in flux. I think you could make similar points as Ambassador Lindemann suggested over Syria. Not now, but in the first few months of the violence, it was not, strictly speaking, an armed conflict. And one of the catalytic events that sort of propelled us down this road of doing this was actually the discussion about Syria, where I got a lot of calls from Reuters, actually from Stéphanie herself, as to, could I please explain what was the difference between calling Syria an armed conflict, yes or no? And the media, over that Syria debate, got quite intrigued, I think, as to, well, why does it matter, and why do we care so much as the media? And it forced us, I think, to reflect on not only about how we do the qualification, but what are the implications. And there the implications are significant because, as I've said, it pushes an act from being a murder or a simple human rights violation into the realm of being a war crime. And that individual who commits that act, if they were to travel to Geneva, even for peace talks, or if they were to travel to the United Kingdom, or Belgium or other states, it's possible that they could be prosecuted for a war crime. And that changes things. And so at that level, it is important to have that dividing line. But I wouldn't suggest that we have political considerations in making that call.
I can see that Professor Krause had some comments on that.
I think you used the words intensity and degree, right? And I think those are the criteria that are recognized. These are intensely qualitative criteria as well. So it's important to understand that this has a political dimension, not in the narrow sense that we're worried about whether a government or donor or party of the conflict will be offended, but that this is inescapably political in its form of judgment. And especially the question of intensity. Most conflicts, as we qualify them, don't occur in a sort of undifferentiated way over a particular territory. They happen in particular places where the violence is highly concentrated, and other parts of the country, like let's say Mexico City, I'm sure, which you were in, is safe. So these kinds of qualifications are political in the very largest sense, and I think using phrases like strictly speaking or objectively don't get us very far in seeing how that judgment is actually going to play itself out.
Just on that point, I think one of the criteria that is important in judging intensity, and obviously this is relevant and you will appreciate this, is the type of weapons that are used. So that in the Yugoslavia Tribunal they have said, well, we are going to make this call in part, and it's not an exclusive criterion, it's not a sort of sine qua non, but looking at the types of weaponry that's being used to determine whether or not that goes to intensity, and in turn that goes to conflict. So it's a little more objective than just saying, well, I feel this is intense. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Other questions? Other gentleman here. Maybe the panel has questions to the audience. That would be nice. No, somebody there. Okay, after, right now.
I didn't preempt anyone, did I? Yeah, I'm sorry. Name's Xavier Colin, formerly of this institute, and I hate to say a political scientist. Actually, I like to say it, but I hate to say it in this context because I should be a lawyer.
Why is that?
Because I should be a lawyer to appreciate this. So I'm afraid I have a cheeky and bald question to, I guess, both the lawyer and the political scientist on the table, on the panel. I'm sorry. The question is roughly this. What was the background population from which you drew for these cases? Because as at least the political scientist up there should know, or knows, I'm sure, is that there are vast numbers of political science data sets that classify armed conflicts as wars or something less than that, whose main criterion is actually the number of people killed in a given year or since the outbreak of conflict. So I was actually wondering, which relationship does your report, which applies international law criteria that we'll have to pay 50 francs for to read, which relation does this data set with these criteria have to the commonly used armed conflict data sets in political science?
You're a political analyst because your question is so long.
Sorry. Well, Andrew Clapham got to say that the report is edited by Stuart Casey Maslin. I get to say that I have seen the report for the first time yesterday or today. So we're not associated with that in the formal sense. I do think that there are a lot of data sets out there that could have been usefully drawn upon in some ways, but most of them are not designed with the same purpose in mind. So in defense of Andrew and the project, they do have a very different orientation. And one of the criteria that has not really been discussed is to what extent the actors have to have political aims in the conflicts. And so many people would leave Mexico out because they see this as essentially criminally oriented violence as opposed to something that has a political aim. And obviously you have a different judgment on that. But I'd like to hear your answer to this question too.
This is extremely delicate and I think contested, whether or not you need to have a political aim to trigger an armed conflict. There is one line, or a paragraph I should say, in a judgment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia when they were looking at Kosovo, and if my memory is correct, but I'm sure someone can correct me if I get this wrong, they were looking at some of the Kosovo groups, and part of the argument was this group doesn't have a political aim, it's a criminal group. And in this case, which I think is called Limaj, the tribunal said, actually, you don't have to have a political aim to trigger the laws of armed conflict. And therefore, we took our cue from that tribunal established by the Security Council, and which is, thought about this for a while, and they went on to determine that the laws of armed conflict applied in this particular context, and therefore the individual could be prosecuted for war crimes, even if their group didn't necessarily have a political aim. But it's true that conceptually and historically and traditionally, one has thought that for an armed group to be in an armed conflict, they've got to have a political aim. But that was not the decision in that case. And if we're true to our sort of mission, which is to apply international law rather than to apply sort of political understanding of armed conflict, that's the route we've gone down.
Yeah, it seems that even tribunals seem to have a different approach now. Maybe thanks to reports like this. That's interesting to see that, you know, those people at the end of the day who will decide who's a criminal, who should be sentenced, who should go to jail. Do you mention that in the report that this evolution is something that you may not have expected that will eventually happen?
Yes, I mean, the report, there are a lot of essays in the report, but in the entries at the very beginning, it does explain the methodology and it does make reference to these tribunals and how they've come to that conclusion, yes.
Une question devant, question right in front, gentleman here. A microphone all the way down. Somebody who's reading. Which page is this you're reading? Probably only page 5. You know, from
Thank you. Jacques Markovic, University of Sao Paulo. I was reading this part, 3 important themes in armed conflict, and I wonder if in the next report, the economics of war should not be considered. I mean, how much countries are spending in weapons. And this means that these resources are being taken from other destinations, as education, health, and others. Do you think that this report next year could consider how much countries are spending in arms and weapons?
Absolutely, I think it's an excellent idea, and I would like to say now that we would really welcome suggestions for themes to be developed next year and the year after and so on. This is really to open out a discussion. It's not that we have a particular way of doing things and we've only got our themes. Themes have already been suggested to us in the last few days, but I think the political economy of war or the economics of war, particularly focusing on arms, is an excellent idea, and that we should certainly do that.
That's a lot of work. Which sources will you be using? Governments, sources?
I think a lot of the information is out there. I think it's a question of finding the resources to pay people to do the research.
Why don't you ask all the students here to do the research? Yeah, that's excellent.
They still want to be made.
I am expecting the papers before Christmas. Other questions? Lady for change? Lady, up there. Thank you for the red scarf. Go ahead. Identify yourselves.
Thank you. I am an independent international policy professional. And my question is, the discussion and presentation so far has as its key concept armed conflict. And I'm wondering how the title of this publication, the War Report, was decided upon, because it seems to have a slightly inflammatory tone to it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Words are important, as we said. I like the idea of being independent. That's very interesting. Go ahead.
I think there is a danger in talking about humanitarian law of armed conflict, that it sort of slightly sanitizes things and makes us think that this is a sort of technical area where the violence has just tipped over into armed conflict. But where we are talking about the Iraq war in 2003 or the war in Syria now, I think it's appropriate to use the war word because it reminds us that it's something absolutely terrible that is going on, and not something which is sort of neat and tidy and somehow just a conflict. I think the word war is appropriate. It's been unfortunately brought back into the vocabulary by George W. Bush in the War on Terror. And I think it's appropriate maybe to remind ourselves that the war is a terrible thing rather than something that we need to rally people around. So it was a deliberate choice. I'm not sure that it was necessarily provocative, but yes, it was designed to focus people's attention on the horror of war rather than a report on armed conflict which somehow doesn't get that emotional thing going.
Satisfied with the answer? Thank you. Too low. All the way up there. A lady again.
Hi, my name is Anissa Belal. I would have a question with regard to the qualification of certain conflict. In fact, My question is, what would you do if you are facing a situation when you have conflicting qualifications? So if I give you an example, on Friday, as you know, the UN Security Council has said that there is an armed conflict now going on in the Central African Republic. By condemning the ongoing violations of IHL taking place there. And in fact, one could argue that at this precise moment, this could be criticized, as we don't exactly know what are the structures of the group acting there, what are the stages of the conflict, of the hostilities between the groups, and so on and so forth. So what would the researcher do? On which kind of information would it base itself to decide, oh yeah, the Security Council here, it's right, but perhaps other institutions would be of a different opinions, and on what basis then would he or she make the choice?
I think one has to be careful sometimes about reading too much into the words of the Security Council.
Anybody from the UN here? Thank you.
There are representatives of the P5 in the room, but one has to be careful, because when those resolutions are drafted, they're drafted not necessarily with an eye to the legal detail, but with an appeal to the parties to respect the law. And often the sort of default is to say everybody should respect international humanitarian law, even if it's not necessarily the point at which it's become applicable. Historically, this was because often some members of the Security Council didn't like the Security Council referring to human rights. So in my experience, the Security Council often made an appeal to international humanitarian law because they couldn't use the human rights phrase because, some governments, I think it's well known, for example, China in the past, didn't like the Security Council using human rights. That's slightly changed, but the fact that the Security Council makes an appeal to international humanitarian law, I'm not sure we should necessarily take as the final word on whether or not international humanitarian law applies. Those resolutions are often drafted quite quickly. Central African Republic is a crisis. In my experience, I could see a resolution being put together quite quickly with an appeal for IHL without necessarily thinking that they are determining that IHL applies throughout the whole country and to this particular group and not to that particular group and so on. So with all respect for the Security Council, I'm not sure that it's necessarily the best place to look for the sole determination on whether or not a conflict exists in the world.
Well, that was the green light for the intervention of the French army, too. Wasn't it? Putting the whole thing under the chapter of humanitarian law.
Well, it's not necessarily about humanitarian law. The Security Council is entitled to authorize the French to go if they want to, yes.
More questions? There's a hand. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Rashad Shinov from the Mission of Azerbaijan. First of all...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Mission of Azerbaijan.
Okay.
Before going to my question, I would like to congratulate the Geneva Academy for the successful completion of the report. And as I am from Azerbaijan, I instantly went to the page 29 and particularly would like to congratulate the Geneva Academy for the correct qualification of the conflict where Azerbaijan is embroiled. But my question...
Page 29, you said?
29.
Let's all go to page 29.
So there are some difficult, very little problems in it, but overall the qualification is very correct. My question is linked to my comments. Would you allow the permanent missions in the future to transmit the views on the report, and would you take them on board while preparing your reports in future? Thank you.
I can be very brief. Yes, that would be excellent to hear the views of the permanent missions in Geneva and New York.
Did they ask for the book already, for the report? Are you going to sell that report to the missions or just give it? Interesting. No answer. Let's see that. Boris has a question. Boris, we said one question, not one speech. We're not live on television, Boris. Go ahead.
Boris Engelson, a local freelancer. War report. Will peace prevail in the world in the coming generation? will it prevail in Europe? Will it prevail in this country? If not, how, why, when? How shall we cope with it? These were the questions. I was misled by the title. I thought this report was about that. Obviously, it deals with violation. So my questions have no place. Do you think that these questions are not legitimate? And if they are, can they be discussed in this kind of report? Can they be discussed in this school?
Well, this is called also the peace report, isn't it?
I'll pass the microphone to Keith, but I just wanted to say one thing. There is an international crime called the crime of aggression, which is a violation, if you like, of peace. And aggressions in the future will certainly be mentioned in the sense that where one state invades another without the due authorization and not in self-defense. I think that does have a place in the war report, and a discussion of aggression would be appropriate.
Before we get started, it's fairly obvious that we don't have a representative of Armenia in the room, because they would, of course, not agree with the characterization of the military occupation of Azerbaijan by Armenia. And I'd like to hear how that plays out. This is obviously not, I mean, as Andrew correctly said, this is designed to talk about violations, and it's not the peace report. There are many other reports that try and tackle that aspect of it. And one of the main things that I think comes out of it is the tremendous transformation away from what we would call international or interstate armed conflict towards purely internal armed conflicts. And this report highlights that very effectively, that most of the actors in most of the conflicts that are listed here are non-state armed groups, or at least one of the parties involved. What it doesn't say is that the overall number of armed conflicts has in general been diminishing over the last 20 years, and I think it would be worth highlighting that finding. But what it should say is that the last couple of years have been, because of the Syrian conflict, incredibly violent. There's probably a third, if not more, of the total casualties of war in 2012 were in Syria, and perhaps even more. So war is a phenomenon that ebbs and flows in this case, and I think that would be something that the report could benefit from, a little bit more of the political analysis of it.
We have time for some more questions. Two gentlemen there, either one of them.
Hi, Ravi Bhavnani from the Political Science Department. You've talked a lot about how we actually determine when an armed conflict begins or when a civil war begins, or how we identify armed conflicts or armed violence. I'm curious as to the criteria you would use to actually classify an end to an armed conflict. So when exactly do armed conflicts end? Do you still use the same criteria? I mean, is it still intensity and organization? And is there some tension between peace agreements, ceasefire agreements, negotiated settlements, and these two criteria that you've put forth?
Either one. Don't fight, please.
That's a very difficult question, and thank you. Peace agreements are definitely part of the story. You could have, of course, though, a continuation of the conflict beyond a ceasefire or beyond an armistice. It's a question of fact, whether or not the conflict is continuing. In a way, once you've sort of reached that criteria, it doesn't necessarily have to stay at that level of intensity for the laws of war to continue. And certain rules under international humanitarian law will continue even after the fighting has stopped. So you have return of prisoners of war and their status and so on. So it's a complex question, and I haven't got a sort of snappy answer for you. It would depend on the type of conflict. For an international armed conflict, it's going to be different than an internal armed conflict. For an occupation, the end of the occupation and so on is going to be even more complex to determine.
I do think that this is actually a tricky point, because in part, one of the things that we find in peace agreements is the so-called spoiler problem, where one of the dissatisfied group resorts to arms and continues the struggle, even though there is an overarching framework. And I think that would be the case in Iraq, which is one reason why I would have counted it in and not out.
Okay, we have time for two more questions, and at the end I will ask each member of the panel to probably say 3 ideas or figures that they retain from the report. So, no more questions. The two ladies on that. Don't fight. Only one of them of you will speak out.
She was being kind. My name is Payush Chaudhary. I've managed to browse through the book briefly. My question is, based on the data sets that you've collected and everything, and based on the international human rights laws, how would you classify the Kashmir issue, if at all you see it as an issue?
No answer, huh, to that question. Professor Krause, would you be ready? You have no idea. Andrew? Uh-huh.
I need to check exactly the...
Take the microphone to... It's not in there. I haven't read it yet, but no. Stuart? Or somewhere? Is Stuart somewhere? Where is he? Oh! Go ahead. You will have a microphone. There's no way you can get away from that question. You have a microphone? Yes. Thank you for answering that question.
Thanks for the question. Kashmir was a difficult one, and I'm not sure whether we got it absolutely right, if I'm brutally honest. We looked at the casualty figures that are available, we looked at the level of clashes, and we came down on the determination that this was not an armed conflict as it stood in 2012. I know others could look at the same data or could look at similar data sets and come down on a different determination. So all I can say is we made the determination that it was not an armed conflict. It is something that we will continue to look at very actively.
Last question is yours. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm a Syrian researcher here in Geneva, and my question is about Syria. You defined it as internal conflict, and from a Syrian perspective, I feel this is not a fair definition, knowing that external actors, international and regional actors, have been involved heavily in the war, and they have openly and publicly announced their support, sponsorship, providing of arms, and facilitation of the entry of external non-state actors into Syria. How, knowing that the solution does not lie only, is not only dependent on the Syrian actors, but it requires international and regional agreements to reach a solution. Therefore, the issue of accountability also needs to be extended. And I think the Syrian people also will look to the day when they hold the states who sponsored the war accountable for the destruction and death that happened in the country. I'd like to hear your comment on that. Thank you.
I can only agree with you. I think the key to this is that the international actors who are interfering have to be held accountable, and that is definitely part of the problem. The problem that we have here is that we're giving a legal qualification. I think politically, or sort of in descriptive terms, one can definitely say the conflict has been internationalized. But to call it an international armed conflict for the purposes of the laws of war would have consequences which you might not necessarily like, because that actually entitles some actors to use lethal force, as the ambassador was suggesting before. You would be entitled to kill people on sight, whereas in an internal armed conflict, the rules are slightly different. So one has to be careful in necessarily saying, I want this to be called international because it looks international, because you then trigger a different set of rules which you might not necessarily want to have applicable. So I would be the first person to agree with you that the problem with Syria is the way in which international actors are getting involved, and it's definitely up to the international community now to resolve it. So we wouldn't disagree on that. It's only about which rules for fighting one is going to trigger, where I would say be careful what you wish for, because the consequences are not necessarily humanitarian.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the conclusion of our debate, but as I said, I will ask each member of the panel to tell us what are the 2 or 3 main ideas or figures or propositions that you will retain from this report. Professor Krause and Andrew will have the last word.
Okay, I think I have 3 small things. The first is that there are lots of interesting essays in here. Ones that deal with journalists and education and sexual violence in war, and we didn't talk about that. I want them to do more work on those areas. The second is, as I mentioned, what's not in here. It's not just the Iraqs. Guatemala is not in here. El Salvador is not in here. The intensity of the violence per capita is greater than in Mexico. The level of organization is probably just as high. And the human suffering is just as great. And I think that some attention to how we characterize these kinds of violence would be warranted. And the last is, I don't like the term war. I don't think it really helps us grapple with contemporary dynamics of political violence. And I think that the report is trying to do that, and many other scholars are also trying to do that, but we should keep in mind that this is a very changing context that we're working in, and that war as a label isn't really going to help us get very far.
Ambassador Lindemann, three main ideas.
I'm less critical, including on the war issue. I think one of the advantages of this is really that it highlights some of the forgotten conflicts. The 38, I didn't have all of them in my mind, and we are in a media age, and we seem to forget, to concentrate on 3 or 4, and the rest we will sort of forget. The other thing, it's a really rich resource of information, and the way it compares different situations makes you ask questions. And if you disagree with the qualification why Mexico is an armed conflict, then you have to ask yourself why, and that triggers something. And the last thing, and here I agree also with Professor Krause, the cross-cutting issues, we didn't talk about that, but that's really interesting. And there are a couple of issues, the obvious ones like sexual violence, like drones and so on, but there are some that I didn't have on my mind, like, for example, attacks on education. That was not on my agenda, and I will read these parts with lots of interest.
Julia?
As well.
I think, honestly speaking, one of the things that will stay with me is, of course, the qualification of Mexico as an armed conflict. And I think it will produce many endless conversations and heated conversations, because I think it is very debatable. And I think it's a very important document in kind of mapping the key legal questions that are being discussed in practice and in theory about armed conflict today, and it does that very well, including new issues like the place of education and schools in armed conflict, which is an issue that we're dealing with a lot. And perhaps just in closing, I'd like to say, we shouldn't leave with the idea that atrocities only occur in the context of war, and that we can only prosecute war crimes. I mean, major atrocities in humanity have occurred outside the context of war, and should be prosecuted and continue. So just to put that into perspective as one aspect, but not everything in terms of addressing the crimes that are committed internationally.
Andrew, any regrets about what is not in the report? Then
non,
that should have
je
been.
ne regrette rien.
That's a good song. Go ahead.
You asked me for 3 thoughts. First of all, I think it's educational, and I think I would hope to be able to use it in class, but also with the wider audience around the world, that people will begin to understand more how the laws of armed conflict work. So the first thing would be educational. The second thing that I've picked up today, but I think I knew from the beginning, is it is controversial. And that, I think, is why it hasn't been done up till now. We weren't seeking controversy, but I think we're going to have to live with the controversy, and that's going to be tough. And lastly, I think it's functional in 3 ways. I think it could have a preventive function. I know I may sound naive, I've said it before, but I think if people realize that your activity in war could lead to a war crimes prosecution, I think that could be in some way preventative. I think it could lead to prosecutions, with people realizing that some of these activities do create international crimes which can be prosecuted in many states around the world. And lastly, I'd like to think it's protective. I mean, that the Geneva Conventions are about the protection of the victims of war. And somehow talking about the victims of war and realizing that there's a legal framework sets up a set of obligations to protect people. And I would hope that that would be one of the outcomes.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, all of you, for your patience. Thank you to the Geneva Academy, to the Graduate Institute, the University of Geneva, the Swiss Confederation for putting up this debate. And I think you or we have learned a lot tonight. So good night. Be careful. There's a lot of fog outside. Thank you.